Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the Scottish Universities Press Fireside event, which marks the launch of our second title, Digital Editing and Publishing in the 21st Century. This is an edited collection. We have 6 co-editors for this, so James O'Sullivan, Michael Pidd, Bridgette Wessels, Orla Murphy, Michael Kurzmeyer, and Sophie Whittle. We're delighted to have so many registrations for the event today and to welcome colleagues from many different institutions and from a variety of backgrounds, especially given this collection has such a broad appeal across different areas: digital humanities and literary studies, information science, media studies, computational logistics, and of course library science as well. A reminder of SUP, so Scottish Universities Press is a fully open access and not-for-profit press. It's been developed by 20 university libraries working together through SCURL, which is the Scottish Confederation of University and Research Libraries. We're really excited to support the launch of this latest SUP book, which is available now openly and freely to download in EPUB and PDF formats from sup.ac.uk. It's also available in print formats. And there's a QR code at the top, and there's a link in the chat as well if anybody's looking to find that. We're really grateful to editors and authors for choosing SUP, but we're even more delighted to have a number of them here to take part today. So please let me do some brief introductions before we get started. We have Professor Bridgette Wessels, who's one of the co-editors of the book. She's Professor of Sociology and Social Inequalities at the University of Glasgow. Her research focuses on the development and use of digital technology and services in social and cultural life. This includes digital services and communications in the public sphere, in everyday life and civic life, and social and digital inequalities. We also have Professor Andrew Prescott, who authored the chapter, The Past That Went That Away, Editing in the Rear View Mirror. He's Honorary Senior Research Fellow in the School of Critical Studies at the University of Glasgow. He was formerly Professor of Digital Humanities at the University of Glasgow until 2019, and was the AHRC Digital Transformations Theme Leader as well. From 1979 to 2000, he was a curator of manuscripts at the British Library. We worked on the electronic Beowulf project. And we also have Dr. Michelle Doran, who's one of the authors as well of the chapter Digital Scholarly Editing and the Crisis of Knowledge Technology. She's Ireland's National Open Research Coordinator, coordinating the activities of the National Open Research Forum and guiding the delivery of Ireland's National Action Plan for Open Research from 2022 to 2030. Michelle's background is in humanities research, programme management and digital humanities research projects. And until 2022, she served as Irish Principal Investigator of the UK-Ireland Digital Humanities Network. I think I could probably have a whole day of questions just about things in your bios to start with, but we won't do that today. I'm also joined by my colleague Gillian Daly, who's the Executive Officer of SCURL and the Press Manager for Scottish Universities Press. I should also mention myself, I'm Hannah Whaley. I'm Chair of the Management Board for Scottish Universities Press. I'm also the University Librarian at the University of Dundee and Director of Library, Academic and Cultural Services there. Now, this book itself that we're going to speak about today introduces a topic and perspectives I'm sure we could spend a huge amount of time all day and maybe even several more discussing. It's been really great to see how well this book has been received so far. The authors urge us to explore the full potential of digital text and digital scholarly editing and question why publishing remains rooted in the cultural and structural logistics of print. The editors have brought together 20 chapters that range from practical design to more conceptual topics, but also engaging with topics around accessibility, queer approaches to editing, and artificial intelligence. This is a conversation born of academia and rooted in creative opportunity for publishing. So I am really excited to get this chat underway. I'm very conscious I'm holding everybody back from that while I'm just outlining a little bit more. So let me tell you before we dive into that about the format for today and how everybody watching can get involved as well. How we'll start is we'll ask some questions of the panel about the publishing process and then guide a conversation about the book itself. But after that, we will be turning towards questions submitted either during registration or throughout the Q&A over the course of the event. So please take this as a call to action now. Start thinking about questions you'd like to ask and post them in the Q&A. We'll aim to get through as many as we can within the time that we have. There's a chat function available throughout the event for any sort of informal exchanges or to alert us as hosts to any issues, but please do use the Q&A to submit questions to the panel, and we'll be working through them. So with that means we can actually turn to the chat and start chatting about the book, which I'm sure everybody is keen that we do. Can I start with Bridgette, please? And can I ask you why it was important for you to make this work open access?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of, as you know, there's a lot of attention being paid on open access publishing, but also open access to data. And I think that's really important in terms of value. If we think about it, our research and the work that this book was sort of created through was publicly funded by the Irish Research Council and the AHRC. So there is a sense of kind of giving back to the public. I think it's also really important for democratizing knowledge and encouraging people to engage with kind of work that's sort of valid, it's authoritative, and they can engage with it. Now, we might have all access through the universities, but people leave universities, they might still want to carry on. And when we think of the cost of a monograph, I mean, that's sort of a hard copy, 80 to 120 pounds. Not everybody can afford that. So I think it's democratizing and opening up that space for access to really good research. I think it also fosters much more engagement with research. People sort of check the data, they engage with the debates. So I think it kind of opens up the research that we do to different kinds of audiences. And I think that's really important at the moment. You know, there's all this notion about disinformation, misinformation. And I think what's needed is really kind of authoritative work that people can trust and that they can go to as a check. And I think, therefore, there's a really important role in that. I think another aspect, and I think this is why we chose Scottish University Press, is that it's not for profit. So I mean, I can remember when I first got my PhD, got that published, then I wanted to write other books, but talking to more commercially led publishers, it was, well, how many copies might you sell? You've got to write something that will reach these X number of audiences globally, And you felt that some of the really interesting work and groundbreaking work got lost, or it got lost in short form, in journal articles, whereas often in the long form through a book, people can work through that argument much more. So I think open access publishing is important on lots of different levels, from an academic point of view, from a readership point of view, and in terms of ensuring that knowledge is democratically available to different publics. So I think that's why we chose to go open access, and Scottish Universities Press in particular, because I think it is, it's based in Scottish sort of university libraries. We've got that insight and that support going through, but also that scholarly tradition is being protected and celebrated, I think.
Yeah, well, that's really, really interesting to hear, Bridgette, and I'm not surprised with how you're describing it there, that we've found a sort of synergy with SUP, and I think that sense that by opening it up, you're interested in the conversations that come from the book, this idea that you're not just picking an audience, but actually allowing some space for others to find it and enter conversations, and yeah, that's a really valid point about that sort of democratizing things in that way. I wonder if I can address to the whole panel. So you can choose to jump in first, or I'll pick names. We can take turns. But I wonder if you have any advice for colleagues who are thinking of publishing an open access book. Now you've been through this process with us.
I won't jump in. I'll let somebody else.
I mean, from my point of view, I found the process, the editorial process, but that tells me a lot about the editors as much as the press, was very easy, very disciplined, and I felt that we were being encouraged to produce work of the highest quality. In terms of thinking about open access, the reason I'm very struck by the way that SCURL, which has been such a fantastic innovator in terms of collaborative projects in the information world over the years, why I'm very struck by this initiative of the Scottish Universities Press is also that I think we got the funding models wrong for journal publication. and that far too much was ended up behind paywalls, and the universities ended up paying for the privilege of accessing their own research. And the business model that's proposed here with Scottish Universities Press seems to me a good way of avoiding the same pitfalls with open access book publishing. So I think it's a very, very timely and very exciting initiative.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. It's definitely a way for us to pursue library-led publishing and understand what that looks like, and how we do that, and what that means in terms of the openness and democratizing that Bridgette mentioned.
I think it's sad that we didn't, that the way journal publishing worked out wasn't more library-led.
I agree, Andrew. I think that's a really important point. And there's a lot of debate at the moment that some universities are pulling out of some of the really kind of Elsevier and some of those models because it's so expensive. So I think there's something about sustainability, isn't there, in kind of business models for publishing.
I think that sustainability is very important. I think we'll come back to that when we start thinking about editions. But I mean, we're all very conscious of the devastation caused by the loss of the British Library's resources during its cyber attack. But on top of that, another important issue with sustainability is financing. And all the university librarians will know that nowadays the bulk of the money goes on the electronic subscriptions, not on buying books. And there's got to be a point where that ceases to be sustainable, given the pressures on universities' finances. And what happens when you lose a major journal subscription is a big issue.
Yeah, they're a really, really timely conversation for any librarians in the room, definitely. Michelle, do you want to come in as well on that advice for any colleagues thinking about OA and publishing OA?
Yes, so just first of all to say thank you very much for inviting me to contribute to this morning's panel, and congratulations to each of the editors. I thought rather than offering advice to anyone considering publishing open access, I might offer advice to those considering still publishing in closed access formats. And my first piece of advice to those individuals would be to fully educate yourself about the rights that you are transferring to the publisher when you choose closed access publishing models, to check the author agreement very carefully before signing it. Often, though not always, with copyright transfer, you are the publisher owns the work and controls how it is reproduced, distributed and reused. And I don't think that a lot of the time authors still don't fully understand the implications of what signing that copyright transfer actually means. Another then kind of practical piece of advice would be to use tools like Sherpa Romeo to check the publisher policies on rights and archiving. And then lastly, I would say that if retaining rights is important to you, then perhaps you need to consider open access alternatives for publishing. So that my advice really is to those still considering closed access models.
That's very pertinent, Michelle, with the current anxieties around big tech companies scraping content for AI training. That's a very good piece of advice.
Yeah, absolutely. These arguments, I suppose it's kind of the law of unintended consequences, and we're seeing kind of the repercussions of giving over so much of our content to publishers. Now, that's not to suggest that all publishers are the bad guys, but rather just there are implications that perhaps are still coming to the fore and we haven't fully considered yet.
Michelle, that's really practical advice for people. So I like that idea that there are tools, there are ways to inform yourself, and that we are all, as Andrew's saying, seeing the longer term landscape that's emerging from some sort of historical publishing patterns and loss of rights that have occurred. So yeah, I like that line of very guided advice, but to people not thinking of a way yet as to where to look.
The other practical thing that people might consider who are thinking whether or not to go open or closed access, which I don't think is increasingly taken into account, is that if you went closed access, it might be because you have an enthusiasm for a printed book of a particular type. And I think the authors aren't aware of how many publishers are now exclusively depositing legal deposit copies in paper places like the British Library in electronic form. So given that many university libraries now increasingly only buy ebooks as well, very, very few people might actually buy the physical book. And if your publishers that you're thinking about go down that route, again, open access has a lot to commend it.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I think, as Bridgette mentioned, the cost sometimes prohibitive of print books. It's another factor that's been very much on our mind at SUP about having the option of formats, but that being within a more reasonable sort of financial bracket. I'm thinking it would be good to turn our attention to the book itself. We're kind of hinting and teasing little bits about the book as we go, but I'm sure lots of people that are listening would like to sort of delve into that more fully. So I'm going to ask if Gillian would like to direct some questions.
Yeah, thank you, Hannah. Really delighted to see the book published, and really happy to have the opportunity now to speak about some of the themes there. So as Hannah mentioned earlier, we do have quite a mixed audience today, so I thought that would be quite helpful and also mirroring the book. But to begin our discussions, to set out what we mean when we're talking about digital scholarly editions. So from James's introduction, I know that is not without complexity. So I thought perhaps we could begin with the panellists helping us out here a bit and offering their preferred definitions. As editor, Bridgette, I was going to pick on you first, if that's okay to begin.
Yeah, thanks, Gillian. And I think here the complexity of what digital scholarly editions, how you might define them. I mean, my sort of co-editors, James, Mike, Orla, and Sophie, going through the project with them, the complexity of kind of what that means has come through very well. And I think really James's definition really resonates for me, that he argues that digital scholarly editions are sort of scholarly editions that are guided by a digital paradigm, both in theory, method, and in practice. And I think for me, there's something around what is a scholarly edition, and it's a critical representation of text or document. And I think unpacking what critical might mean, I think critical can mean historical, but also in terms of the comment, the validation, the engagement with that, the critical engagement with that text, but ensuring that that text or document is accurately represented. And people can search that text and explore that in detail as part of a research, undertaking research or close reading of a particular text, and then zooming out in terms of understanding the wider context. So, I've learned a lot from my co-editors. Fabulous.
No, I think that's really helpful. And I think one of the things that stuck out to me in reading it was the movement from critical to enhanced as a kind of way of thinking and looking at it. That resonated with me certainly as a definition.
I think so. And I think that's one of almost the key problems that the book, but also the project wanted to address, was that, how do we maintain that criticality, but how do we enhance that in the contemporary period? So different voices, different contexts, but also ensuring that validity of that knowledge as it's coming through, and how can we use the digital to enhance the ways in which people can engage with a document. So, information about sort of dating, or language, those kinds of things are really important if people are using a scholarly edition to learn with and through.
That's really, really helpful. Does anyone want to come in? Any of our other panelists want to add anything to that? No, you've absolutely covered it. Oh,
I think
I think in my piece, I'm arguing to some extent, I would agree with the importance of criticality and the value of James's definition in his discussion. But I increasingly worry that the metaphor of an edition, because I think it is a sort of metaphor, isn't a very helpful one in a digital environment. That came to me very early on. You mentioned that I worked in one of the pioneering digital edition projects, the electronic Beowulf, which really, it should be very straightforward because there's only one manuscript of Beowulf. So you wouldn't have thought there's an enormous amount that you could do with it. However, the damage that occurred to the manuscript in a fire in 1731, the fact that you can use special lighting techniques to read certain parts of it, the importance of early editions and transcripts made before the manuscript started to deteriorate, meant that while at the heart there was an interpretation of the texts, really what we assembled was an enormous range of resources about the texts. And somebody said this is not so much an edition as an archive. And I do think that when one looks at a lot of the most exciting digital editions, they're precisely that. They're more of a corpus of resources that you can use to explore a particular text, or it could be a film, or it could be a piece of sound. And so I wonder how useful the idea of the edition is. I'd hold to the idea that something should have authority. I think that's very important in present circumstances. But I'm not sure we've actually come up with a description of what we really do in a digital environment very, very well so far. And I hope that one of the things that might come out of this book is a discussion around that.
I think so, Andrew, because I think, you know, for me, the exciting bit is that you're keeping that core, but the ways in which different readers and audiences can engage, or different researchers can engage with that particular text, but also all the information around it. And I think one of the things that, and I think that the book really shows, is that, you know, the complexity of that and understanding and working with something that's a little bit in flux. There's opportunities, but there's also challenges. And it's also then the practical aspects, you know, the infrastructure aspects, the tools for making that actually happen. You know, there's a lot of hype, but actually doing it requires quite a lot of skill. And so it's the how as well as the what, and how that comes together.
And one of the things that we realised increasingly is that as we've compiled images and records of manuscripts like Beowulf, that we see that they've changed over the years, and we can provide an accurate statement. In fact, one of our co-editors, Michael Pidd, in a piece of work he did on Chaucer manuscripts, drew attention to the fact that early photocopies of the manuscript contained material that had subsequently disappeared in conservation work. And how does one work that into an edition? Again, you come around to the idea of a kind of resource, of something that is, as Bridgette says, in flux. All that gets even more complex when you start thinking about born digital material. And a lot of this discussion really derives from transferring printed or manuscript text into a digital environment. But what happens when you're talking about things that actually live digitally? What do you do about that?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, you know, the scale of the issue here is really clear. And I think, Andrew, in your chapter, the serious issues of scale in relation to born digital compared to print is, you know, a key focus. It has to be said as well that your example of Irvine Welsh wreaked havoc with our filters, profanity filters at SUP. So you have actually encouraged us to put in place workflow improvements for that reason. So there we go. We're learning all the time. But the conclusion for your piece is ultimately that we do need to have improved workflows that respond to those challenges of born digital. And I wonder if is there coordinated work going on already to develop consistent workflows?
Well, you had some very good examples in the book that I was very pleased to learn about. Gabor Toth's discussion of Holocaust testimonies is a wonderful example of how digital affordances can enable us to approach very, very large quantities of material and look at those in different ways. And I was also very struck by Peter Boot's discussion of the visualization of court records in St. Louis, partly because I've got very interested in court record flows here, and that's the record flow. I think the workflow. I think I'd single out. The National Archives in London has a project called Find Case Law, which is a workflow for digitally transferring judgments, for example, from the Supreme Court into pretty well instantaneous or very short term online publication, so that, for example, the recent Supreme Court judgments on gender equality, the judgment was immediately published in both a press format and in the full judgments, and that was made available via Find Case Law. So it's an interesting workflow. The intriguing thing about that comes back to authority again, because that you'd think that's almost a kind of pure, uninterrupted workflow, but the Supreme Court also has its own YouTube channel, and the YouTube channel shows people reading out the justices reading out the judgments, and if you take the gender equality example, that's very intriguing, because there's the full judgment and a press version available on the website, but the version that's read out in court is different again. And when you throw the fact that there are also full law reports into that, the question of where the authority lies in that mixture of born digital court records is a rather intriguing one. The National Archives website said you should only refer to the full judgment, but that leaves aside the question of historically you've referred the full law report, and that leaves that aside. So even where you've got a good workflow, questions of authority can come up, and where that authority lies.
And how do you feel, those are kind of specific standalone or examples. Do you feel like the workflows are necessarily specific to the context, or is there something we can be doing wider? This is me with my Scuttle hat on. I can't help myself, Andrew. I just think, can we work together? Can we do something around this? Do you see it as being too maybe complex for generalization, or
another aspect of the Find Case Law project is that it's APIs. It marks up legal markup language. Its APIs make those materials available for further analysis, and there are lots of things that you could do using that API, and how you kind of link all that together, I think, is another major challenge. But again, you're moving away from the idea of a single edition, because you're looking at how you link together a corpus of materials, because, well, increasingly the records of the judgments of other courts are being added. So kind of how you court judgments together and follow that through. There's a lot that you can do there.
That's really interesting. I'll definitely have a closer look at that. I'm going to move over to Michelle now. Michelle, the chapter you worked on draws on the core values of digital scholarly editing, really, and starts to reimagine the boundaries and to explore opportunities for how you work in future and working differently. So the approach that you came up with was called radical iterative editing, and I'm just wondering if you could talk us through how that differs from traditional scholarly editing, and just if time allows, actually, because I'm realising this is a really big one, but just outline the potential for this approach to be applied within the AI landscape.
Yeah, so first of all, I just want to acknowledge that I was a co-author on this chapter. So there were 4 other authors who contributed to it. I've always been very fascinated with the idea of authority, and I think, as Andrew's comments have just demonstrated, the kind of issues and challenges and signals of authority, they pervade every part of the editorial process, be they traditional kind of analog based scholarly editions or digital scholarly editions. And so in the kind of this approach of radical iterative editing, the term radical then points to the possibilities that come from using digital tools and working in digital spaces. And they include kind of fully acknowledging that editing is a subjective process. So working from that basis and making it explicit and opening up the process of creating knowledge and making it more transparent so that both readers and editors can understand how decisions are made. And that perhaps from when you reflecting on kind of definitions of digital scholarly editions, this openness is potentially one of the most powerful impacts that comes from using digital technologies. The term iterative then means that recognizing that all knowledge and culture works are constantly evolving, and because of this, there is really no final or definitive edition, and that any edition is just one version of an ongoing process that could continue for hundreds or even thousands of years. The authority of a radical iterative editing approach then derives from the open nature of its composition. So just kind of changing maybe the paradigm for authority itself then. AI, wow. So this, our contribution was submitted, I think, largely before generative AI became our collaborators and colleagues on you know, a day-to-day basis. So we were thinking more in terms of explainable AI at the time, but I think a lot of kind of the basic ideas of the chapter still hold up. In fact, they hold up incredibly well when we look at kind of AI as we're using it, and when you consider how quickly that has come about. So using the example of open source AI, you know, using open source AI entails a lot of trust and a lot of those signals of authority that are both implicit and explicit, and that scholarly editors are very kind of comfortable with and kind of intuitively recognize. And so it's about examining, well, in this context, in the context of open source AI, what are those signals of trust? What are those signals of authority, and how they might be made explicit and leveraged to a certain extent? And then before this call started, actually, there was an interesting call amongst the panelists about how they're using AI in their own work. And I think, again, those questions of trust and authority, of opening up how scholars and academics are using generative AI in their workflows and their processes are very, very interesting conversations to have. And also, I think as well, how that impacts upon the reader's perception of the work is quite important. So if I were to say, I wrote this abstract using ChatGPT or Claude, how does that impact your perception of that work as a scholarly piece of work? And are there ways in which we could make explicit how we collaborate or work with AI to maybe enhance those trust or authority signals? I think the questions that are asked in this chapter, whilst they were asked before generative AI really came to the fore, are still very, very pertinent.
I think that came across really strongly to me when I was reading it, because obviously I did have the awareness of when it would have been written and have been, you know, part of the process since the beginning. But I really felt like the issues were so pertinent, just looking around at kind of situations in the news today or the past week or whatever, that so much of what you're saying is absolutely totally, like, that nothing has been lost in that passage of time from writing that to get into publication. The issues, the fundamental underlying issues, are absolutely up to date, and in some ways we maybe preempted some of the things that we're looking at. So I think that's absolutely true in terms of just thinking about what the wider significance of this work is. And I think I'm just going to end on that before I'll let other people in to ask a question. Just Bridgette, over to you if you don't mind. So that kind of idea of wider engagement or interaction with digital scholarly editions. the aspiration is stated in the introduction of engaging more broadly, or that being a way that the discipline wants to evolve in terms of working with general publics as well as research communities. How do you see digital scholarly editing fit in an everyday context to audiences beyond the research community? You mentioned, earlier about democratizing information, and that's, I'm sure, a central part of it.
I think the projects, all the different projects we've got in the book, where in those chapters show that the kind of variety and creativity that's actually enabled through digital scholarly editions is really important. I think for me, there's two. We've talked about born digital, and we've talked about digitizing in kind of some sort of ways. So I think where a digital scholarly edition can specifically help is in terms of the increase in born digital. So we've got platform poetry, we've got poetry coming through, we've got different ways of writing. And I think making that more open and accessible to our reading publics, because that's how people are beginning to read, is really, really important. And I think we're used to very much those social media snippets or AI summaries. And I think it's really important for publishing that the sort of digital scholarly edition enables people to engage wider reading publics, different publics, and that can be journalists, it can be people reading in libraries, it can be school children, actually engaging with new ways of writing and understanding that writing, but then also being able to trace that back to the original data. So I think that's really important. So there's a core value, but also a specific kind of set of activities that digital scholarly edition can do. On the other hand, it's also about opening access to very established literature. So looking at Chaucer, for example, and the work being done by Michael Pidd and his team around sort of the Pardoner's Tale was looking how can we use AI to enhance the reading of Pardoner's Tale, make it more accessible. And I think there you've got that notion of we've still got those, if you like, the canon and that literary tradition through which our language develops, through which how we read develops, and being able to widen access to that in an understandable way, but also in an inclusive way. There's now tools whereby people can ask questions from that and feel they're engaging with the text. And it's not something that they're taught in the classroom. You can only access it via printed format and codex, but there's nobody to discuss that with. So I think in terms of the value, it is actually supporting our reading publics to be critical, to engage with different kind of texts and to understand the right, how we write, the forms and content through which we express ourselves. And I think that is part of a broader education, and that critical ability to assess data, AI summaries, and actually other written texts in a critical way is important in terms of understanding, truth, fact, information, misinformation, but it's also part of who we are, how we engage within our culture and in our society. So I think it's part of the fabric of how we live the lives and how we make decisions about what's important. So I think it can open up, but it doesn't just open up access, it opens up engagement, and it enables different voices to come through. So for instance, there's a chapter by Calando around, different kinds of voices around sort of queer publishing and queer voices coming through, but enabling that not just as something that's written, but as a way of engaging with those discourses and those narratives. I think that's really important. And I think it also, as another chapter talks about, it's a seamless engagement. So people can start to engage with those conversations and those narratives from wherever they're sitting. And I think that's really, really vitally important.
Yeah, no, that's kind of where I was thinking there as you're talking. I'm thinking about as a young person not having had access to that at school because I'm far too old, but like thinking about, as somebody who would have wanted to explore literature myself and not having anybody who really wanted to go on that journey with me, but like having that as a support, having those kind of external, sources being brought in, having that as a resource, being, like you say, a substitute for that conversation in life. So I feel like there's almost even an inequalities impact within that, in terms of the things that maybe you don't have socially in your life being brought in through this, which I think is really is something that strikes me as significant.
Yeah, and absolutely. Colleagues here at the University of Glasgow kind of looked at the reading poetry and the fact that many people felt that was quite alienating. But actually, if there's a way in which people can start to engage with those texts,
Yeah.
if we think about contemporary poetry, but also going back to, say, Chaucer's tales, there's a sense of, if we think about art, the way languages develop, and understanding that history of, say, art language or literary forms and content gives people a richer way of engaging. So in the project, we talked to students in the US and the UK engaging with Chaucer. They had to understand Chaucer, the language, form and content and characterization. But what was interesting was that active learning, where they were then reflecting on the debates about Chaucer in the contemporary period. And so it was that critical engagement that they could reflect and almost gain more insight into the debates of the contemporary, as well as going back historically. So I think when we think about text, when we think about reading, we're engaging in it. It's an active process. And I think digital scholarly editions, if we keep shaping them in the way that, some of the creativity happening in that sort of field, because I think it's an interdisciplinary field that has to come together, we are opening up that resource for that engagement with literature and other kind of art forms.
I would just ask, just as you were mentioning poetry earlier, when Michelle was speaking about iterations, something that was going through my mind was that idea of when we've sometimes seen something by a poet that's published, and then many years later you find they've continued to work on it or develop it, and it's continued to have a life of its own for them as a creative project, and that's something that might come through in archives or in letters or sort of research in that form. And I think I've always seen digital as a risk of that, like we delete the earlier one or we don't keep working on something because it's done. But the way you're framing it there sounds like it's much more about finding opportunity in that route that we have for something to have a sort of a continual evolving life.
And I think, Hannah, you're absolutely right, because one of the risks which we haven't talked about, I think it's because it's been an exciting book and it's about possibilities, also actually some of the hard pragmatics of what's needed for that. But Andrew raised that early on, are some of the risks that actually something born digital can be lost. And there's a sense of understanding that process. Work we did with Anne-Marie, a poet in Ireland, with James's team, she spoke very much how her work started digitally, and how that evolved, then it became the written word. But I think you're absolutely right. It's being able to trace that creative process.
Yeah.
And of course, there is then back to that sustainability aspect. What do we choose to keep? And what gets lost, and how, and Andrew's talked about some of those things that have got lost. So it's that critical sort of engagement and decision making about what we keep and what might get sort of buried away somewhere, which digitally is probably more difficult.
When we're talking about more digital materials, bear in mind, which I think it doesn't actually get discussed in the book, but it's a very important sphere. If somebody is writing in Word, there's a heck of a lot of metadata going on underneath the hood that tells you a lot about how that person is proceeding, when they're making changes, the sequences in which they're making changes. To do that, you need a fully forensic copy of the Word that preserves all those underlying things that we don't usually think about. And to my mind, that's just as important component of an edition of something like that as our discussion of the nature of manuscripts or illumination or any of those other physical features of the pre-digital texts. So there's a forensic requirement there that we don't probably pay enough attention to.
And that's very interesting. And that's definitely in my train of thought where I'm interested in creative practice. So it's not just about the text and the end analysis of that, but it's about how do we understand what went into it and at what stages, and how we continue to learn and understand that. So yeah, that's really interesting line we've gone down there. Thank you.
There's another thing I would add to the discussion here about authenticity, that my background's very much in editing historical records rather than literary records. And with historical records, we're always concerned with dealing with bulk. So that, for example, for a lot of the material I use, the medieval records, we had this curious thing called a calendar, which is an abstract of the record. So the original document might be 2,000 or 3,000 words long, and it's reduced to a paragraph and published as a calendar. And that's an integral part of the process of historical editing. We look for that to be reliable, but it's never going to be the same words. But it's astonishing how, with printed calendars, how far people take those almost as if they're original sources, even though they're abstracts done by somebody in the 19th century. We could envisage, calendars have been revived by the available digital editing. We could envisage a method whereby we could now handwriting recognition of the sources, which would then produce enormous quantities of text, and we could use AI to produce the calendar. We'd want to be transparent about the process by which we were doing that. But I suspect that if we got that working reliably, we would use that just in the same way that we use the calendars, without ever referring back to the original document. And those issues of bulk are ones that loom very large in the historical field. And as I discuss in my chapter, I think increasingly we're going to want to use visualizations, statistics in order to approach that sort of problems, those problems of bulk. And that's possibly what an edition of historical records 20 or 30 years from now might look like. It might be a visualization rather than a textual representation.
Thanks, Andrea. I'm thinking of time, and I'm wondering, Gillian, if we might turn towards some questions that I know we've got waiting ready to go. Do you want?
Who would have thought two librarians would have hijacked this conversation? Okay, so we have, I think it's more of a kind of reflection on the situation in Poland coming through from Agnieszka. So I'll maybe just go run through that, and if any of our panelists have any comments on that. So in Poland, there is a rapid connection between critical, I think, to the writer's intention. So it cannot be used for scholarly editions with different aims. And so struggling to use critical as a synonym for scholarly, and case studies that were not only about finding ideal copy text. Is that any comment or thoughts on that one? I don't know if
it's a problem. These problems of transferring terminology like critical are problems that are constantly difficult in working across different linguistic cultures. One issue I always find very problematic in working with European colleagues is their insistence on the term scientific, which where I would regard it as scholarly, and talking about the state of science. That doesn't really quite work for me. So that I think that those terminological problems are very important. And there is a problem. We know what we mean by scholarly and critical in that context. And I think we all know in our hearts what we mean, but our terminology doesn't quite align with it.
I think so, and I think it's that, you know, the different European traditions come through when I've worked sort of, and also globally, but I think that language and understanding that language, so probably one of the things that we need to be looking at is, you know, as the book shows, actually defining what a digital scholarly edition is complex anyway, and I think things are opening up and in flux, so maybe this is a time for different European countries or different European libraries. I mean, is it a job for libraries, but where we can come together and start to actually unpack what these terms might mean. I think that's really, really important. And a digital scholarly edition has the potential to open up the space, possibly more so. So there is opportunity there, but it's not easy to solve.
Well, we do love a controlled vocabulary in libraries, so
that's right.
Maybe we can contribute there. But no, I think it is really it's an interesting point about whether when we're all trying to converse, if we're speaking about the same things or different things based on based on the language.
If I could add, sorry, just
Yeah,
that
please,
the
Michelle.
use of specific language can be quite political as well. I'm the National Open Research Coordinator. That's very deliberate, that it's open research and not open science, kind of just reflecting on what Andrew was saying about kind of the state of science, for example, that it doesn't quite resonate with arts and humanities researchers. So there is just a political component to the use of certain terminology and languages as well.
Thank you, Michelle.
Just before you jump in, Gillian, I'm just going to do a call out to our participants, people watching, that this is a good chance. If you've got a question that you have in mind or you've been considering, do pop it in the Q&A so that we have a chance to pick it up before we're reaching the close of the session. So if you've got something coming to mind or that you've been sitting on as we're chatting, wondering we'll get to it, do ask it now so that we can pick it up. Sorry, on you go, Gillian.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say we do have another question that's coming on chat, noting that the session is timely. The question then is, how do we determine which sources are authentic, information being, available everywhere? And as Andrew's rightly pointed out, some information may become distorted as it circulates across different publications, be it that some parts are removed, others embellished or rephrased. So this whole question about authenticity and how we determine that.
I think sometimes we're rather naive in our belief as to how we can promote authenticity and reliability in the digital environment. I wrote a piece, which sadly has never been published, on the controversies around the birth certificate of Barack Obama, which is very interesting for me because that's fundamental source criticism if ever one gets, if one's thinking about birth certificates. But when you look through what the birth of people do, they're actually engaged in fairly, I wouldn't call them legitimate, but fairly conventional techniques of source criticism, only kind of as if it's done on steroids. And the arguments are all very positivistic. They're all based in the evidence. They're based in the primary source, but they're over-reading it and they're over-criticizing it. So they are based on authentic evidence, but they're reading things into the evidence that probably aren't there. And a lot of it's often around what our critical structures are and how that works. The whole issue of reliability and authenticity is just a huge one in this sphere.
And I think, Michelle, I don't know whether you wanted to pop in.
Yeah, absolutely to agree. I really liked that expression kind of about as digital scholarly edition is not just one about open access, but rather about open engagement. I thought that was quite a powerful description of them. And I suppose in opening up the processes of knowledge creation, you're also educating individuals maybe that aren't as well intentioned as to how to leverage or exploit those processes of knowledge creation as well. And so I think it's really it can be really quite challenging, particularly for kind of the lay reader coming to text to disambiguate what when all of those signals are there, all of the trust signals, all of the authority signals, the language looks familiar. What exactly is authentic or authoritative? I think those questions are really quite hard to answer, as Andrew said, in a digital environment.
And I think it boils back to actually, is authenticity the right question? It's understanding the data and be able to understand the characteristics of data, what it can do, what it can't do, what the risks around that are. And I think that's where, in terms of developing digital scholarly editions, sort of colleagues in digital humanities, people like Mike Pidd, one of the editors, is actually really clearly understanding, be able to sort of understand the characteristics of data, its risks and what it can tell you. And I think then another important part of a digital scholarly edition or sort of editing going forward is having transparency around different sources. And so there isn't this definitive these are the things that you have to be careful around when you're looking at this kind of data in terms of that. So, and of course, if we think about it in the wider context, something you've been asking me, one of the key skills that we've got missing are data skills, across the piece. So in many ways, it becomes more important that people learn about working with data and understand what, the affordances of different kinds of data and how to assess that.
Everybody, if you know me at all, you'll know one of the things I really dislike doing is just bringing an interesting conversation to an end, but that falls on me to do today. I'm just mindful of the time that we've advertised for everybody on the webinar. Can I just pause to do some thank you? Thank you to Gillian for co-hosting this with me and asking such excellent questions and guiding much of that discussion, and to other colleagues who facilitated this event and supported the publishing process, somewhat more behind the scenes, but including Dominique Walker and Paul Clark and Jennifer Loudon. Incredible thanks to everybody in our audience, everybody that's registered and attended, and appreciating the questions that have come in as well. And really particular thanks to our fireside guests today. So Bridgette, Andrew, Michelle, for chatting so openly and sharing your insights and letting our discussion take some tangents as well. But your experience, I think, is very interesting to everybody, and really sets the scene for the book itself, of course. So Digital Editing and Publishing in the 21st Century. A reminder that's available open access from the SUP website, sup.ac.uk. The link is in the chat. You can read online, you can download it as a PDF or EPUB for book readers, and there's also chapter links as well, which is quite useful for navigating and quite a good way to access different parts of it. You can also purchase a paperback or a hardback copy if that's your preference, all normal retailers, and for library colleagues from our standard vendor options as well. We have a further fireside event later this month when we'll be chatting to author Dr. Richard Irvin about the forthcoming SUP title, The Vow of Stability, an ethnography of monastic life. That's on the 22nd of May at 2 p.m. So I hope we might see some people there as well. But as we close today, just reflecting for a very brief moment that we've learned an awful lot, I think, about digital scholarly editing, but the additional potential for digital technologies to shape and reshape our interactions with scholarly works. We've touched on an awful lot of different areas, everything from, I think, case law and markup, authority and iteration and AI and reader perceptions. And I love that we've even got financial sustainability of library budgets in there somewhere at the beginning as well. So always a favorite topic. I hope everybody's watching has enjoyed the conversation. I think often many people registering may watch this later. So hello to you as well. But I hope for everybody, whenever you're accessing this, it gives you some room in your day to think about and explore digital innovation, and that you'll download and share the book and enjoy extending the conversation even further. So yeah, let me close by just saying thank you to everybody. And it's been a really great conversation, really great session.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Just put one more person here, and then we can chat. I just remove them. Okay, I just removed them just in case they went off.
Yeah. Do you want
have we
to
stopped recorded or?
Yeah, I'm just going to stop the recording.
Perfect.